Hello, this is Mikhail Khazin speaking. I'm starting our broadcast today. How can a new system of social governance be built, and how can new elites be formed both in our country and abroad? Why will this be an entirely new structure? After all, it would seem that there is a theory of power which says that, well, structurally it's all the same. There are power groups that interact competitively. There are the leaders of these ruling power groups who form the elite, and there are the leaders of the non-ruling power groups, the counter-elite, who dream of overthrowing the elite and taking their place without changing the model. There is also the anti-elite. These are also power groups, but they are aimed at destroying the most prominent existing system. The most striking representatives of this anti-elite are organized crime groups. Some might say that organized crime dreams of taking the place of the elite. That's true. But organized crime understands perfectly well that it can't take a place in the current elite without destroying the system itself. That is, unless being part of organized crime stops being a criminal act and no longer serves as a barrier to joining the elite, it has to disappear. To achieve this, the entire existing system must be completely destroyed. That's the picture. So, why do we need to discuss this? And here's why. Because, as it says in Stairway to Heaven, the key thing that any power group must have, not necessarily the ruling one, but any group at all, is resources. If you don't have resources, then you pretty much automatically lose to those who do. Resources can be all sorts of things. For example, the main resource of the drug mafia is the people who buy drugs, creating a massive financial flow. But the main resource isn't the financial flow itself. Everyone vividly remembers that truly famous and incredibly vast room, which was absolutely overflowing and completely stuffed with an immense amount of illicit cash, undoubtedly originating from one of the most notorious and powerful Colombian drug lords. And did it help? So, if you truly do not have a viable way to effectively convert the valuable resource you currently possess into usable power, then that particular resource inevitably starts to significantly lose its inherent meaning and overall value. And if we carefully look at the economic situation over the last approximately 50 years, basically starting with the implementation of Reaganomics, so around the years 1981 or 1982, we will clearly see that almost all valuable resources that previously existed were systematically converted into financial money. And they were converted in exactly the same fundamental way, which is precisely called monetization. In other words, if you possess a valuable resource, it truly doesn't matter what specific kind, for instance, an informal group of armed individuals, commonly and widely known as a gang. Or, for example, you have some kind of innovative technical method, or maybe you're a religious preacher and you have a group of followers. Basically, whatever it is, you need to do two things. The first is to create a market to which this asset, this resource, can be brought. And secondly, you need to sell this resource, get money for it, and, accordingly, cut the coupon. Some will say that it has always been like this. Not really. But as an example, I can assure you that during the Great French Revolution, the French royal family had more money than the people on the streets. But they failed to convert it into the kind of resource that actually worked. Louis XVI. Let's note that a bit later, when the uprising happened, Napoleon converted this resource in a completely straightforward way. He rolled cannons out onto the street, loaded them with grape shot, and the crowd scattered. Let me draw your attention to another small nuance. Napoleon didn't monetize the cannons. No, of course, the soldiers who operated them were paid a salary. Gunpowder also costs money, and so on and so forth. But I can assure you, that's not a lot of money compared to the resources that were actually needed. In other words, at that moment, Napoleon understood that the key resources were loyal soldiers and cannons. And the amount of money you have sitting in the bank or wherever else plays only a secondary role, as long as there's enough for gunpowder and cannons. You could talk about this endlessly, dissecting any situation. As you know, Stairway to Heaven has a second edition called Crisis and Power, where, essentially, the theory of power from Stairway to Heaven is mostly in the first volume, and in the second, People of Power. It specifically describes concrete situations with real people, with specific resources, and how they used them. So, the point is that lately, everyone has fallen in line under a single resource, with very few exceptions. Look, for example, why is it that no one can even get close to Kim Jong-il? Moreover, recently we've seen that South Korea has started facing very serious economic problems, considering the tariffs that were imposed by the United States of America, thanks to Donald Frederick Trump. It's absolutely clear that South Korea will die economically. And in this situation, well, I don't see any other economic option but for it to submit to the DPRK. Moreover, knowing the humane nature of the North Koreans, and I'm not joking now. You see? You might absolutely hate the rules they've put in place. You might despise them, think of them as whoever you want. But for those who follow these rules, this regime is absolutely humane. There is no senseless violence like there was, for example, with the Red KHKHKH Khmers in Kampuchea, or, for that matter, in those Latin American regimes that use death squads as a tool to intimidate society. Because you never know in advance who those squads will come for. I can assure you, in the DPRK, that is impossible. If you behave properly, no one will come for you. That's why it's a humane society, and for this reason, South Korea, I'm not ruling this out, it's just a hypothesis, yes, might even be considering today the question of surrendering. At the same time, as an arbiter to prevent any excesses, Russia will most likely be used. There are some hints of this. Again, this is not, like, a forecast, and certainly not a prediction, since I don't make predictions, it's just a certain logic. So, the DPRK does not monetize its resources. A very hardworking population, very clearly stated positions, and, well, a high level of technology. By the way, I have a theory that, in reality, the interaction between the elites of North and South Korea is much more active than what is described in various books. Yeah, I even thought about asking a question about that today. I'll ask it, but so as not to get sidetracked, I'll post it in my Telegram channel right after the end of the first part, during the commercial break. So, the mechanism by which any elite groups operate today is called the monetization mechanism. They've monetized all the resources they have. And this is where the economic crisis hits. It immediately brings to mind Winnie the Pooh's song, and suddenly the weather turns nice. Why am I so happy about the crisis? It's very simple, because it's better to have a terrible end than terror without end. Because it's already absolutely clear that this liberal model, which is fundamentally based on Reagan's reforms, even though Reagan himself was an out-and-out conservative, But economic logic always trumps any wishes, has led to the fact that every single power group in the Western world, and Russia is part of the Western world. Let me repeat the basic thesis once again. I've already talked about it several times, but I'll say it again. It's pointless to make claims against the Russian monetary authorities as long as there hasn't been a political decision to leave the Western world. As soon as that decision is made, it will be necessary to change personnel in quite a number of places accordingly. But as long as the decision hasn't been made, and in this sense, our monetary authorities might take offense at being constantly criticized in the press, with people saying, guys, make a political decision, we'll handle things ourselves, because we're not satisfied with another model. We don't really understand this one either. Well, I just can't resist a jab. Yes, they really don't understand it. They're just executors who follow instructions, not people who are actually in charge. I mean, their status in that system is very low, precisely because they have nothing to say. That's it. And by the way, if you look at some signals and symptoms, even Sergei Glaziev has a higher status there than the heads of our monetary authorities, if you look at it objectively, because he actually has something to say. By the way, that's one of the reasons why he's, as they say, unthinkable. But, accordingly, there is no political decision. We are in the Western system. So, in this very Western system, all management of all power groups is carried out exclusively through financial mechanisms. That is, even if some power group had a unique resource that had absolutely nothing to do with finance. For example, these are people, well, like Teal, right? He has this Palantir program that watches everyone, spies on everyone, knows everything about you, absolutely everything. Those famous jokes, when the program starts prompting you, like, you haven't eaten this, you haven't drunk that, you haven't taken this medicine, and so on. And you also have two mistresses, and you need to give something to one, and you need to give something else to the other, and so on and so forth. That's it. All of this already exists. It all works. The other question is, who actually needs this? It's the same situation. You see? In the old days, you could blackmail a person by saying, look, you have a young mistress, she's 21, and you told your wife you were going on a business trip, but actually you went away with her for 3 days. Doesn't matter where, to the Maldives or wherever. Wonderful. So, if someone tells your wife about it, she'll make a scene, so you could be forced to do something just so your wife doesn't find out. In our harsh times, the only resource that's really worth anything is money. That's why you can tell your wife, honey, that wasn't me at all. I left, yes, but I wasn't in the Maldives. I was somewhere in Madagascar. And I had a conference there, and we have this kind of business there. And, accordingly, our competitors want to undermine our business, so they used artificial intelligence to create this crap with the photo. Well, just look at me. I've got a belly. I'm already old. But that pretty young lady they drew, well, obviously they took her from somewhere. Yeah, I mean, how? Like, how much money would I have to give her? I don't even have that kind of money, because I give everything to you. By the way, don't you want to go shopping in Dubai? That's it, and that's the end of the story, right? Any normal woman would immediately figure out that it's better to pretend she doesn't understand anything. Yeah, and it's the same with everything else. The only thing that still works is the story with pedophilia. That's something society still doesn't accept. But even here, using Epstein's Island as an example, we see that there are some issues, right, when it comes to publishing Epstein's list. I don't know why, but everything else is absolutely monetized. Blackmail has lost its meaning. So basically, if you need something, you go to the official's marketplace and say, I want an official who can solve this particular issue. Immediately, 2 or 3 sellers rush up to you and say, yes, here I am, I'm ready to do it. Just give me this much cash in a suitcase, and then you have a choice. Here are 3 people. In our country, they're called fixers, but they exist everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And this is pure money, nothing else. I remember the 90s well, when you had to solve some tricky issue, and smart people would sit around figuring it out, like, in this ministry you need to do it this way, write this kind of document, give it to this person, the document will go here and there, and the reaction will be such and such. Nobody cares about that today. By the way, that's one of the reasons why the level of officials and bureaucratic skill has dropped so much. No one thinks about that anymore. Any official knows exactly that they're on the market, and accordingly, their services are worth a certain amount. Their goal is to increase their own monetization, and as for the fixers, their job is, well, to do what, right? To lower the actual price that needs to be paid to solve the issue as much as possible, and, accordingly, to take as much as possible from the client, because the difference stays with the fixers. That's it. That's the whole, the entire picture. That's how everything works. Absolutely everything. Well, just look, for example, at the famous story with Ursula von der Leyen. All these companies that sell vaccines approached Ursula and said, Ursula, how much do your services cost to make a decision for the entire European Union that our vaccines must be purchased? And every 3 months at that? That's it. That's it. That's exactly why it's so hard to prosecute Ursula, because she acted according to the rules. It doesn't matter that these rules don't comply with the law. Who even reads those laws? Do you have the resources to make that law work? No resources? Then forget about it. So, continuing on, the whole problem is that if you've built the entire system around these kinds of financial flows, around monetization and the market of monetized resources, so naturally, everyone starts monetizing whatever resources they have. In other words, the gangsters start selling their services. If you want to get rid of your competitor, that'll cost you a certain amount. If you want to warn him, that's a different price. If you want him to pay his debt, that'll cost something else. Of course, if he actually owes the money, it'll cost less. And if he hasn't heard anything about it, then it'll cost more. But it's still a service that's available on the market. And then a very interesting thing starts to happen. So you've put your service or resource out on the market, but it's either not selling or selling for less than you'd like. Basically, your gang costs you $2 million a month, but you're only selling services for $1,800,000. So you have to put in $200,000 out of your own pocket every month. It's not a huge amount of money, you have it, but it's still not right. And so you start doing all sorts of promotions, advertising, and so on and so forth. Basically, all of modern political life is just the promotion of the resources of power groups to increase their capitalization. And if you have capitalization, not just a product or service on the market, but also a standard price and, accordingly, a typical turnover, then you can take out a loan or issue securities. This is the most interesting thing that has happened literally in the last 10 or 15 years. And this is where it turned out that it's only the bankers who run everything. Because when you take out a loan using the resources of your power group, you no longer have free control over those resources, since you are obligated to pay back that loan. And as a result, that's how you ended up with this ultra-liberal society, with all its LGBT stuff and all sorts of other things. Because a universal system of control was created through the monetization and capitalization of the resources of power groups. And then the worst thing happened, when it suddenly turned out that this very financial system that made all of this possible stopped working. And suddenly it turned out that some small gang of 5 or 6 people was capable of doing all sorts of things. Well, for example, here it could be some groups of, immigrants, and nothing can be done about them. I mean, well, you can do something, but not within the framework of this old no, only within an alternative system. For example, back in the days of the USSR or in the 90s, this was not a problem at all. A group of special people would show up and just chop some heads off, so to speak, and I can assure you that among migrants, among religious fundamentalists in Western Europe or elsewhere, they have a very keen sense of what is allowed and what isn't. They get smacked on the head once, and they say, all right, we get it, we won't do that. And they really won't. That's it. But still, the old methods don't work anymore. Why is that? Because for those methods to work, what do you need to do first? First, you have to bring them to the market, and as soon as you do, a whole bunch of people immediately show up wanting to use their services. Because you can't really use the services of intelligence agencies or regular military units there. Those have long been monetized. Their price is high, but these newcomers are just entering. Their price is low, so it's very convenient to use them. And those who are supposed to keep order, they say, guys, hold on, who's going to pay? You want us to open a criminal case? Here's the fee. Oh, you want us to close the criminal case? That's not right at all, but here's the fee. And that's how it works. I'm telling you, that's how everyone operates. It's a system for monetizing the resources of power groups. That very Western system we live in and that liberals praise so much, which is actually pretty funny if you really look into it. So, the whole crisis, which is why Dmitry Vladimirovich and I were talking, by the way, we still haven't come up with a complete answer. And it's all because this monetization model simply doesn't work anymore and won't work again. And that's why a different kind of resource is needed now, a real one. And it needs to be used properly. That's what makes our upcoming life so interesting. There was a logic to the Russian world that existed in 2014, but in 2014 it was taken away from us. I highly recommend watching an old but still relevant interview with Sergei Vasilievich Kolmogorov from the Truth Street Club, where he goes into detail about the events of 2014. Back then, at least in Eastern and partly in Central Europe, we really would have been greeted with flowers. But by 2022, there were already major problems because they had done an incredible job of purging society. I mean, even Comrade Stalin pales in comparison. None of the NKVD, whether under Yagoda, Yezhov, or Beria, managed to carry out in 10 years the kind of societal purge that the Ukrainian regime accomplished from 2014 to, 2022. That is, everyone who openly expressed sympathy for Russia was either killed, or brutally marginalized, or forced out of the country. Exactly. There might be people that now who are ready to welcome us, but they're so afraid that they don't even dare to think about it. I can assure you, they will continue to be afraid for a long time even after we arrive, because they'll be scared of unexpected visitors in the night. because they've been told in great detail how the Banderites operated out there in the West. Let me remind you, in the West, they only managed to deal with the Banderite underground because they stationed a garrison in every single village. Yes, the garrison wasn't very large, but it was impossible for small gangs to attack it, and it was impossible to gather large gangs. But I'll say it again, this required, well, it demanded enormous resources and, an incredible amount of work. As for our own country, I want to say that, without a doubt, the fifth column definitely played its part, right? It's true, there was confidence, huge sums of money were allocated to support the Russian world. It turned out that all this money was stolen. No one has been punished yet, and that's for the very reason I mentioned at the very beginning. There still hasn't been a political decision to leave, to exit the Western system. And in the Western system, Banderites are seen as a good thing. That's why all those people who actually fight against them start having problems. They have assets in the West, and very often their children are in the West too. That's how it is. Well, I don't even need to point fingers, right? There are so many different stories here, aren't there? Like how it's completely obvious Banderites by origin end up as members of our Federation Council. Or, for example, how our governors end up in London, and in pretty good shape, too. And so on and so forth. That's how it is. And many haven't run off to London yet. They're still holding their positions. That's the story. So it's really difficult, isn't it? We're going to have to change our society a lot, but that's clear too. I explained why in the first part. Because the mechanism for managing power groups is also built on this same system of capitalization and monetization. There's nothing you can do about that. But if we assume that, within the framework of a financial crisis, the consequences of the collapse of this market, the monetization of resources by power groups, become very serious for South Korea, and there are clear signs of that, then that's when things get really interesting. So what are they supposed to do? Go to jail? You know, right, that all South Korean presidents have either been executed or sent to prison. That's just their karma. And for that reason, they all, well, you could run away to the United States, but then you're no longer part of the ruling group, just a person with some money. Your money will be taken away by lawyers and all sorts of other helpful people, and you'll just become an ordinary citizen. People who were part of the state elite, come on, that's impossible. So what's left? The only option is to look for a new patron who can offer a different model of governance. And who would that be? Actually, you don't even have to look. Here they are. These aren't some scary Japanese who might shoot someone or chop off a head. And they're definitely not Americans who look at you like you're savages. No, these are your own people, even relatives. You'd have to be a fool. Again, this is the logic if this whole monetization model collapses. I think this scheme is actually very interesting in terms of getting results. You can't buy North Korea because there is no market. You get it? It's impossible. I mean, how are you going to give money to Kim Jong-il, open an account for him in an American bank? He doesn't know how those banks work. Well, actually, of course he does, since his sister studied in America, but he also knows perfectly well that if he doesn't have all the power of North Korea, including its nuclear might, behind him, then that account will be closed immediately, and he'll be accused of corruption, drug trafficking, just like General Noriega, and corruption, and they'll throw him in an American prison for the rest of his life. He understands this perfectly well, which is why you can't buy him using these kinds of schemes. Do you get what I mean? North Korea's resources aren't monetized by Western standards and Western models, but they do exist. Now, the question is, why do these ruling groups need these corruption schemes? Is it really impossible in Russia to govern the country officially without all these shady schemes? It's obvious this person hasn't read Stairway to Heaven. No country can be governed without gray schemes. It's impossible. Some of these gray schemes are legalized within the framework of special services, which, by the way, still break the law at every turn, literally everywhere, all the time, because otherwise they simply can't function. And then, let me repeat, there are the anti-elites, who basically operate in a gray zone, and without them, nothing works out. There's the well-known story of Kazakhstan in 1991 to 1992, when, amid the collapse of the USSR, they quietly wiped out all their organized crime, and then ended up drowning in street hooliganism. They had to restore it. You see, life is complicated. It can't be described with such simple schemes. I'd like to wrap up my talk for today. Here's something that many people don't understand. In fact, first and foremost, it's the bosses who don't get it. They're always looking for someone to blame. So, these scoundrels supposedly want to disrupt this wonderful system in which we're all so comfortable. Dear comrades in charge, it's not about scoundrels, it's the objective situation. This system can't sustain itself anymore. It simply can't go on existing. We need to think about what will replace it, how the collapse will happen, and how new people will behave. That's what's truly interesting. And you, for your part, refuse to understand this, and that's why you'll end up as victims, because you haven't prepared a transition for yourselves from the old system to the new one. That's your main problem. But, as you can imagine, it's hard to explain this to people. There's no way around it. People, in general, really don't like to change their behavior. Well, that's all the time we have for today.